my experience as well, both of those with those people I've worked with, as well as my own personal experience, that the Watchtower Society is, as some people say, hard on families. It's very difficult for a family to stay together. There are many reasons for this. In my own situation, I remember very well going to 5 meetings a week, which is 5 hours, commuting time, preparation time, going out in service. In my case, as a servant in the congregation, I had to spend a great deal of time in committee meetings and so on. I found that I was literally spending 30, 40, and sometimes 50 hours a week, plus working 40 hours a week. So it simply absorbed almost all of my time. So aside from working and going to meetings and so on, there was literally hardly any time left for the family. And so the time factor alone causes problems. I remember rushing to get dinner ready and to eat dinner, and we never washed dishes after dinner. We had to go to a meeting, and by the time we got back, it was often 10, 10:30, and then we didn't feel like cleaning up the kitchen and so on. So the kitchen was a mess until the morning, and then we had to get breakfast, and I had to go off to work, so I left all of that for my wife to do, which was very difficult, very hard on us. And of course, the major impediment, I think, in keeping families together is what often happens is when people become witnesses, both quite often do not become witnesses in the family. And therefore, you have what they call a divided household. Typically, the wife was a witness and the husband was not. So this caused perpetual conflict, as one would imagine, within the family. Also, what commonly happens is when one begins to have doubts, the other doesn't. So one leaves the society or leaves the organization, the other doesn't. So this not uncommonly causes a divorce. Also, we find that within the society there is a great deal of, for many reasons, immorality going on. And this also serves to divide the family. One is put in many tempting situations within the congregation. So there are many, many reasons why the family is not the solid family the society likes to picture it as.
It's interesting, Jerry, I've noticed in the articles recently in the Society's publications that there's a considerable emphasis on the youth. It seems that they're drawing their attention to the problems amongst the youth, rebelliousness, this, that, or the other thing, certainly warning them against many of the hazards of modern life, drug abuse and so forth, which is very practical advice, obviously. But it indicates to me that there's a considerable degree of problems amongst the youth. Now, that existed when I was serving as an elder. That was the case back then, and I'm sure that some of the things that are maybe taking place today, pressures in school or whatever, seems to be exacerbating this problem because they are definitely turning their attention to this. Now, I remember even my own daughter, she led a very lonely life as a child, really. We discouraged her from having friends apart from those that she had in the local congregation that were also Jehovah's Witnesses. She spent every day in the hall so that she wouldn't have to stand for the national anthem or flag salute. There was all the little activities that were normal to the school child that she could not engage in. She could not engage in birthday parties or any Thanksgiving activity or whatever. It was all a no-no and a no-no. And I think that it had an effect upon her. I think that she was a very, very quiet, withdrawn, and lonely child. Fortunately, she's turned out to be a fairly normal, well-balanced individual as an adult. I'm not so sure, though, that this is the case with all children. Even in my experience, I saw some that were really, really suffering from some real withdrawal, real emotional problems. And I suppose with your background and your interest in this whole area, you have observed this and possibly even more.
Yeah, I agree very much with what you brought out. I think it's very difficult to grow up a normal child as a witness because there are so many things that you cannot do that everyone else around you does. And you are severely isolated from friends, from developing normally, socially. In my own case, the school that I went to, there was no witnesses. So I was not allowed to associate with anyone. I had to grow up by myself, so to speak. And I did not have any people that lived nearby that were young, about my age, and were witnesses. So as a result, I had to turn to other means to satisfy social needs, which is not easy. It's not easy for a witness to grow up in this environment. The thing that bothers me, I think, is the society does seem to be oblivious to this. They seem to feel, well, it doesn't matter. Just do the best you can, and Armageddon will be here any day, so it doesn't really matter. But it is true, I think they realize more and more it does matter, because young witnesses have many severe problems. And I think they realize now they have to respond to these in some way. So that's why they do have more and more articles about the problems of young people and how to deal with these. But no matter how hard they try, I think, as long as you have a situation where you see everyone else as evil, where you cannot partake in so many activities, in sports, in extracurricular activities, in student government activities, in almost all school activities except the minimum required activities, when these are all off limits, I find it hard to understand how anyone could grow up a normal child under these circumstances. Of course, many do later adjust. Many do overcome these problems they had as a youth. But it takes a lot of time and a lot of work, I think, to overcome the stigma that one has growing up a witness child. And it is a reason why many people who were raised witnesses have so many problems later on as adults. And I worked for the court for a number of years, and many of the individuals I worked with were raised witnesses. And it intrigued me how someone raised a witness could end up a murderer, a rapist, involved in some heinous crime. But I found many were raised witnesses and involved themselves in these crimes because they were so socially maladjusted that when they became adults, they were not adequately able to cope with adult responsibilities and adult life, and thus, because of maladjustment, ended up involving themselves in these crimes that they did, that I saw them involve themselves in.
You know, Jerry, with respect to the judicial committees and the type of things we used to have to handle, some of them were a little more innocuous than others. Cigarette smoking, while it is a dirty habit, of course, I'm not totally convinced it's a salvation issue. There were many other things, of course, drug abuse and many cases of immorality, things like that. But I remember a case in particular that stood out in my mind as being pretty unusual in certain respects because of the fact that this is, this supposedly fine Christian organization and what the fruitage would be of that. It was three young men in their 20s, actually, probably late 20s, and they were from our area here, and they went out to Palm Springs with revolvers, actually, and got involved in armed robbery. They stuck up a camera store, which was an obvious judicial committee arrangement, and it did result in a disfellowshipping. The three young men were disfellowshipped, of course. For that, it was a very clear-cut case, and there was prison terms involved and so forth. Did you, in your wider scope of examination of matters like this, did you find, or have you found that this type of thing would prevail in an organization like that?
Yes, I did find the same thing pretty much. I worked for the court, as I had mentioned, for a number of years, and in my experience there, I was shocked, actually, to discover that there were many individuals who were raised witnesses who were deeply involved in crime. And I explored to some degree why this is true, and I found when the witnesses discouraged higher education, when they had discouraged career advancement, when they discouraged an individual from developing him or herself, I found the result of this was people were forced to stay at the bottom rungs of society. Many witnesses were lower class, or at least lower middle class, and as a result they associated with an element which was heavily involved in crime. So I found many witnesses were dragged into crime or involved themselves in crime for various reasons. And I was quite surprised to find that there was even a number of cases that I worked with that involved brutal murders. We had one case where a young boy had robbed by gunpoint a paper boy, and the paper boy resisted, so he shot and killed the paper boy. There was another young witness who his family were very involved in the witness work, and he was involved in quite a number of rapes in the community. And finally he got a natural life sentence because he was seen as such a threat to the community that they felt it would be best that he's put away in the prison for as long as he lived. And while working with these individuals, I had a chance to talk to many of them to try to find out why they involved themselves in these heinous crimes. And I found many of them were involved in such things because they were so frustrated and so angry at the organization they were a part of that they lashed out against sometimes those they loved, sometimes against strangers. So there's a reason, I discovered, these people did the things they did. Now, sometimes it was because of their environment, but I think the witness religion tends to force people to stay in a lower class environment. It forces them to stay in poverty, in a poverty situation, or at least a lower middle class situation. And this tends to involve them or facilitate their involvement in criminal activities. I think this is something we need to look more carefully at in organizations such as the Witnesses, because some organizations encourage education. The Witnesses, in discouraging education, produce a lot of negative ramifications, such as the high level of crime, and I did my PhD thesis on crime, by the way, and one aspect I studied was religion and crime, and I found that in most cases religion had a positive influence on criminal behavior. There was only a few cases, one of which was the Witnesses, where religion had a negative influence on criminal behavior, at least with the population that I worked with.
The sad indictment, Jerry, I think on the society is the fact that they don't encourage, and in fact they discourage, professional help for the membership. I think that perhaps if that had been utilized down through the years, perhaps many of the things we're talking about wouldn't be as extreme as they've become. But in fact, in my experience, and I'm presuming in your experience, which is far wider in that area, that's the case. They just discourage professional help.
Yes, they do very much discourage a witness who has emotional problems seeking professional help, and I think this is a tragedy. I've seen so many cases where a witness needed some type of professional help and did not get this help, and therein lied the tragedy. One case in particular I worked fairly closely with was a witness who was very active in the congregation for many, many years, and he started to behave very strangely. And they thought that possibly the furniture in his house was demonized because he had bought it from the Salvation Army. And so they decided to begin to burn his furniture to destroy the demon influence. So they burned one piece after another, and they had burned almost every piece of furniture in his house when he was still getting worse. So they thought, well, maybe it was his clothes. So they started to burn his clothes. And then they started to burn other things in the house, his family portraits and so on. And finally they realized this was not working. And so finally, partially because of my encouragement, they took him to a medical doctor for an examination. And the medical doctor right away recognized that what was wrong was probably a brain tumor and encouraged him to be taken to a hospital. They finally found out indeed it was a brain tumor and he needed surgery. But because he refused blood, they had to find a surgeon that would operate on him without the need of blood. And they found it hard to find one. They finally located a surgeon who was willing to try in another city. And on the way to the hospital, the man died. And to me, this is a good example of what happens over and over again. Witnesses are discouraged from seeking professional help. Now, it's true they're generally not discouraged from seeking help from a medical doctor. But in the past, they were. In the past, medical doctors were criticized or frowned upon. And less that became true. Now, it's psychologists, psychiatrists, and generally mental health professions that witnesses are taught to stay away from. And this still causes problems, although the society doesn't have a blanket prohibition. But if you read the literature, it's quite clear that going to a mental health professional is seen as basically wrong, or at least immature. And the witness ethos, the witness feeling, is very, very negative towards mental health professions. And as a result, many of them do not get the type of help that they need. And even medication, in many cases, in the past at least, has been frowned upon.
Yes, it's interesting, Jerry, as you say this. When we consider these statistics over the past 10 years, it's common knowledge that approximately 1 million persons have left the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. Now, this is no small number. What we're talking about there is basically and essentially a third of